Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the University of Houston Law Center Environment, Energy, and Natural Resource Center's lecture series. We have a wonderful speaker to finish up the year in 2021. Before we do, though, let me make a few quick introductions. First of all, I'm Tracy Hester. I'm a professor at the University of Houston Law Center. I teach environmental law and am a co-director of the ENER Center. I also am a co-director as well of a separate center on campus that is focused on carbon management and energy. I am also very happy to be helping introduce our speaker for today and our center. For those of you who have been listening before, you've heard this, but I'll mention it for some of our new listeners. The ENER Center at the University of Houston Law Center is actually a program that is designed to bring together the areas where Houston is a leader, as well as the energy community, to talk about the issues that intersect legally when you talk about energy. We are obviously putting a great deal of effort on the energy transition that's underway, but we cover all the waterfronts, including everything from oil and gas law to intellectual property to corporate transactions. The idea is to provide a forum where we can support research that captures the strengths and the dynamism, if that's such a word, dynamism, there what I'm thinking of our Houston area. So if you're interested in what we do, we have a website. And one of the things that we do is we do sponsor this lecture series, courtesy of a grant that we received from the Mercury Foundation, which is being shepherded particularly by Professor Victor Flatt and Professor Gina Warren. And I believe Professor Warren's on our call for today. Our final speaker within that series, it is my great pleasure to introduce Tibisay Morgandi. She is a lecturer in international energy and natural resources law. She's based at the Energy Law Institute at the Center for Commercial Law Studies, and she is a public international lawyer who teaches and publishes in the area of international energy law, international economic law. She's a Swiss National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow at the University of Cambridge, and she is, sorry, let me admit folks as I'm introducing, holds a PhD in Master's International Law from the Graduate Institute in Geneva and an LLM from Harvard, as well as several other academic qualifications, truly an extraordinary career. She has also been admitted to the bar in Italy and has consulted for the European Commission, as well as the Chatham House Client Earth International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development, and is fluent in English, French, and is native speaker of Italian and Spanish. So with that lead in, I know we are all looking forward to your topic for today, which was going to focus on international energy and security.
Thank you very much, Tracy, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me today. I'm very happy to be here with you and to be talking about a topic that I have been looking at for the last few years, which is energy security in international law. I will share my slides in a few minutes, but before we start getting into the nitty-gritty of the topic, if I may, I would like to encourage the audience today, if they want, to engage in a conversation with me, to ask questions, even while I am presenting. So I'm happy to take questions as I speak. And, happy to hear your views on what has been one of the topics that I find the most interesting in international energy law and on which I have published in the last couple of years, a couple of articles. And I'm happy to direct you to these two articles if you're interested in knowing more of how I see the relationship between energy security and international law. And I'm also happy for anyone who wants to turn on their camera so that I can actually see some of your faces. It's, I think, easier even for me as a speaker to speak to an audience when I see your faces, but I obviously understand if you don't feel comfortable or, can't turn on your camera this morning. So Tracy has already introduced myself, but just to give you a sense of why I have decided to focus on energy security and international law. So as Tracy was saying, I am a public international lawyer, and within that field, I have decided to specialize in international energy law. Now, some may question whether international energy law is a field in itself in international law. We're very familiar with other fields, but international energy law is an emerging field within public international law and cuts across several areas within public international law, such as international environmental law, international investment law, international trade law, human rights law. So as an energy law specialist and an international energy law specialist, I look at questions from all these angles. And that is also why I find this field truly fascinating, because it allows me to look at some questions from very, very different angles. So why energy security? Well, obviously, is one of the most significant issues that humanity faces nowadays, together with the energy transition. And I will briefly go through the concept of energy security with you and what I think is the role of international law in guaranteeing a so-called secure supply of energy. But before we get to that, I might share my slides so that you can see what I'm talking about. So I'm gonna quickly, let me see, slides. Perhaps I might need some help. Slides at virtual background. Is that perhaps maybe, let me see if this works out. Can you see? I think you can see me at the bottom. I've actually never used this function. It's actually quite cute. So I will be populating my own slides. So what is energy security? I have already mentioned that, but the International Energy Agency has given what is considered one of the most used definitions of energy security. And the definition is the following, the one you see on the screen: the uninterrupted availability of energy resources at an affordable price. So a secure supply of energy. And why is that so important? Obviously, energy is a major driver in our lives. We cannot live without having access to energy, or our quality of life is severely impaired with our proper access to energy. And international law has a role in securing energy, a secure energy supply. And we will see in a minute why. But as part of the definition, we see also the availability of energy resources at an affordable price. Why? Because obviously, as consumers, we need to be able to afford access to energy. And if we're not able to afford access to energy, this boils being able to. Should I repeat what I was covering, Tracy, or you think it's fine? Okay, so if we cannot afford having access to energy, then it's pointless, because we won't be able to have electricity, we won't be able to heat our houses, we won't be able to have functioning transportation, we won't be able to have our fridges turned on, our AC, to move to town using our car. So our quality of life will be severely impaired. So within the definition of energy security, we have all these elements: the uninterrupted availability. And also, uninterrupted is quite an interesting term, because having an intermittent access to energy would also be problematic. And we will see later on in my presentation why intermittency, which is one of the aspects that are most problematic when we're talking about renewables, is actually an issue. So this uninterrupted availability of energy resources is this secure supply of energy. And what has international law to do with energy security? Because one could say, well, every state can try to meet consumers' demand at the domestic level? And why do you need international law actually to step in? Well, there is actually a very important but quite straightforward factor in these, which is the fact that energy resources are unevenly distributed among states across the world. So many countries are heavily dependent on importing energy resources. Other countries are instead, making a lot of money via exports of energy resources. So they're, one of the major sources of revenue is the exportation of energy resources. So they see an economic benefit in exporting energy resources. But most importantly, importing countries that are considered resource poor, will need to import energy resources because they don't have enough, or they lack either the capital or the infrastructure to develop their own. And when we talk about energy resources, I'm sure the audience, is familiar with this, but I will say it just so that, I'm clear about the terminology I'm using. We really mean everything from fossil fuels to renewables to electricity, which is a process, a secondary source, as a process form of energy. So most countries around the world are not energy independent. Therefore, they will need to import energy resources. And that is where international law kicks in, because international law obviously regulates relationship between states and tries to facilitate the exchange and export of energy resources, as well as the transit of energy resources, which is another aspect which I will discuss today. So international law is fundamental in this context because it will ensure and enhance and facilitate the exchange of energy resources and the supply of energy resources. Now, it doesn't stop there because, I wouldn't, spend so much time on this topic if that was the end of the story. International law does more than that, and we're going to look at what else it does. But what I think is useful is to think of energy security as a concept that can be broken down into two sub-concepts. And those are short-term energy security and long-term energy security. And the reason why I think these concepts are helpful is because, and this is also the link to the energy transition that I would like to make today. When we think about energy security short-term, to turn on and turn off the light today, tomorrow, and in 1 year, and perhaps in the next 5 years, to heat our houses in the next 5-10 years. But because of climate change, we know that it is not sustainable to maintain, the path that we have, the path that we are using to nowadays. And we know that it is not sustainable to keep relying heavily on fossil fuels, because we know that fossil fuels are one of the major contributors to climate change, to global warming, and then climate change as a result. So cannot rely as much on fossil fuels, and we need to switch towards low carbon or carbon-free energy resources, those being renewables. Obviously carbon-free are renewable, but low carbon, we could say nuclear, depending, what your view on nuclear is, because, it involves the construction of big infrastructure and all these carbon-free energy resources. And from an energy security point of view, that's obviously a huge challenge, because we know that we can't switch entirely to renewables right now. We might be able to do that in some countries, and some countries are trying that. You take the example of Iceland. they are trying to do that at a very fast pace, but we know that that's not possible for most countries around the world. And from an energy security point of view, we need to plan ahead. And we need to think, how do we guarantee long-term energy security? And that's why energy security and the energy transition can actually come into conflict. It's paradoxical. We might not think of these concepts as, conflict concepts that come into conflict, but that is, from a long-term point of view, a sad reality. If we want to guarantee a secure supply of energy in 30, 50 years, we need to see how we're going to switch reliably towards renewables. And from an energy security point of view, that is highly problematic, because we know that that requires a huge shift in our lives and also in investments in the energy sector, in energy policies, and it's obviously extremely complex. So that's why I've broken down this concept into two sub-concepts, and I will refer to both concepts during my presentation. So let's start from energy security long-term. So how do we achieve energy security long-term? And what is the role of international law in enabling energy security long-term? So I identify three main areas of international law and three main roles for international law. The first being investment law, the second being trade law, and the third being, something at the intersection between, trade law and what I would call, transportation law, if you allow me the term, okay? So these three areas of international law contribute significantly to energy security long-term. And I'm gonna, in a minute, get into how they do that. You see on the slides, these three, types of contribution. Number one, international law, and in particular, international investment law, contributes by protecting foreign investment. Why do we need foreign investment? Well, we need foreign investment, again, for the reasons I gave before. We might need capital, we might need know-how, we might need help in building the infrastructure, for all different reasons that you can think of. And investment law traditionally protects foreign investors. We don't have the opportunity to get into the details. And again, if you wanna know more about this, I can refer you to my article, which, by the way, has been published a couple of days ago. So it's very, very recent. But the point is, traditionally, investment law protects foreign investors in two ways. First of all, by, guaranteeing certain standards of protection. So the foreign investor will be protected against expropriation, against discrimination, against what we could say unfair treatment, okay? But also the foreign investor will be protected by being able to rely on arbitration, which is an alternative dispute settlement mechanism that enables the foreign investment not to go before national courts, but to go before a more neutral panel of judges, the arbitrators, okay? So investment term point of view, because it protects this type of investments. And we know that any investment, in the energy sector is usually a long-term investment. Because when you decide to explore and produce an oil well, when you decide to construct a nuclear power plant, and even when you decide to build a wind farm or a solar farm, you do have capital, enough knowledge, but also the support of the state where you're operating. And if you don't have a long-term perspective, because your returns will build up over the years. And usually all these projects are, let's say, from 20 to 50 years long projects. So you need a set of protections in place to know that if you will go abroad and make that investment, your investment will be protected and your returns will be protected. So clearly, investment law, and from that point of view, international law facilitates and enables investment in the energy sector, both when it comes to fossil fuels, but also when it comes to renewables. And foreign investment is necessary in order to switch to renewables. So from this point of view, foreign investment is very helpful and will help because there is an uneven distribution of resources across countries in the world. So we need a system that facilitates and liberalizes import and exports, okay, of energy resources. And trade law does that. Now, there are also some shortcomings, and I'll discuss them in a second. But the main idea is, with the establishment of the World Trade Organization, we have a system in place that promotes imports, exports, and transit of energy resources. Now, there are options to this system is not perfect, but the idea is without this system, we will go back to a time where, to import and export resources was very complicated and very expensive because countries will apply tariffs and will make, every exchange highly problematic and highly expensive. And then transit, obviously, if you are, and I take an example that I'm familiar with because I'm based in Europe, Russia exporting gas to all the Mediterranean countries. To get from Russia to Italy, my home country, you need to go through either land or sea in a way. And the idea is you will pass through different territories, also called maritime areas. And again, international law steps in and enables, and facilitates transit across states of energy resources. Now, these are, in a nutshell, the 3 areas of international law that play a role in guaranteeing energy security long term. But I said there are shortcomings, and I will mention a couple just to give an idea. Let's take the example of, foreign investment, okay? And I'm referring here to a real example of a case. So you perhaps are familiar with a change in energy policy that Germany undertook in 2011 after the Fukushima disaster. So before that time, Germany was very keen to promote nuclear energy and had already accepted investments from foreign investors that would, enable the construction of an operation of nuclear power plants in Germany. After the Fukushima disaster, the public opinion in Germany really pushed against the use of nuclear energy. And Germany, from one day to the other, decided to adopt a law which was basically stripping away from these foreign investors that were operating nuclear power plants in Germany. These foreign investors were stripped away of the license to operate the nuclear power plants. And as I said before, when you as a foreign investor want to invest in nuclear energy and go through the trouble of building, constructing a nuclear power plant and operate it, your expectation is that you will operate for 30, 40, 50 years, and over time, you will make profits. And this happened so suddenly that basically Germany was saying to these companies, and in particular, I'm referring to the Vattenfall case. This is a Swedish-based company that had invested in Germany together with other German investors. They were saying, look, we need to phase out nuclear. I'm sorry, we will take away your license and you won't be able to operate your nuclear power plants anymore. And, from an energy transition point of view, one could say, well, it's true that nuclear energy is not as polluting as fossil fuels, because once you have constructed the nuclear power plant, it produces energy and it doesn't cause any emissions. So from an energy transition point of view, it could make sense, but it was better than, you know, using coal or oil or gas. At the same time, one could argue, well, there might be an interest in actually promoting renewables in Germany. And the Germans use a lot of wind, for instance. They have a lot of wind farms. But from an investment law point of view, while investment law in a way facilitates energy security long-term, in this specific situation, because these foreign investors were damaged by the decision of, of Germany, the state is in a paradoxical situation in which at first it had decided to welcome the investment and to promote a low carbon energy source. And at the same time now, because of public opinion, it has to say to these foreign investors, I'm sorry, you can't operate your nuclear power plants anymore, and goodbye. Obviously, the foreign investor sues the government, and there we are. The case was settled actually recently, and Germany ended up paying 2.4 billion euros to all the parties involved in this big arbitration as a result of a change in policy. So investment law from, on the one hand, yes, enables energy security long-term, but also can create issues for a state that had made certain plans, because you can't just change, your mind from one day to the other. And that is obviously highly problematic. And you can't just say, well, I'm going to start, investing in renewables, and I forget about all the legitimate expectations of these investors. So investment law, precisely because it protects investors, sometimes can cause trouble for states that are trying to secure, a secure supply of energy, but that change their mind along the way. So that's just one example of how investment law can be tricky. There are shortcomings. Now, the same you can think about transit. You're all perhaps familiar with the dispute between Russia and Ukraine, and the fact that, obviously, there are obligations under international law to guarantee, the transit of energy via your country. But there are also issues, and we have seen in the past Russia deciding not to supply energy anymore because of an ongoing conflict with Ukraine, and therefore gas not being supplied to the Mediterranean countries in Europe. And how do you overcome this issue? Obviously, international law protects you up to a certain point. And while it promotes transit and free transit, it can't impose on Russia an obligation to supply energy if Russia doesn't want to. At the same time, international law can help by building ad hoc frameworks, regional frameworks, or bilateral, plurilateral frameworks. And here I'm referring to pipeline treaties, which is one type of treaty that I've studied a lot as part of my PhD, and then later on in my life. What is the advantage of having a pipeline treaty? Well, you have a higher level of protection, because if you have a pipeline treaty, and it's a sophisticated pipeline treaty, which might even have its own dispute settlement mechanism, a state cannot simply interrupt, either the supply or the transit of energy from one day to the other. So general international law can help, trade law can help, and usually transit is regulated under trade law, WTO law. The Energy Charter Treaty is another framework that helps. But if you really want to go a step further, you should try to sign a pipeline treaty, which will give you much more legal protection and will enable you to kick in a clause in case one of the parties, stop performing, their obligations. And so this is energy security long-term, okay? I'm gonna quickly move to short-term, and then I would like to open up for questions, because I find that it's the most interesting, element in a presentation. So short term, what is the role for international law short term? And there I'm presenting you with two types of, issues short term. There are so-called intentional interruptions of energy supply, and so-called unintentional interruptions in energy supply. And what examples, I could make of each different type of disruption. So unintentional interruption of energy supply, you will all be familiar with this, is, for example, an oil embargo. We are familiar with the embargo in 1973, which was, applied by OPEC, and which caused a huge disruption in the oil market. The prices of oil were, quadruple very quickly, and these really affected the supply of oil all over the world. And this is an intentional energy supply because OPEC decided to adopt this embargo on political grounds, and OPEC being, petroleum exporting countries, and is intentional because is a result of a decision. And so it came from one day to the other pretty much. And this is one example of what I would call an intentional interruption. But again, going back to the discussion we were having before, is again, Russia saying, I'm not going to supply gas because, I want to affect Ukraine and I'm in an ongoing conflict with Ukraine. So there are several examples that we can think of. Instead, an unintentional interruption in energy supply, you can all, I think of power shortages caused by environmental threats. So a flood, a hurricane, anything that is beyond our control. Now, some could say that because science is developing so quickly, our ability even to, in a way, predict that there is going to be a power shortage is much greater now than it was, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So we can take measures, to avoid power shortages, but it's not always possible. And the idea is those unintentional interruptions in energy supply can be highly problematic and can, in a way, affect energy security short term. And what do I think are ways in which international law can come in to help? Well, when it comes to the first example that I was making, the OPEC embargo, the international community responded fairly quickly by establishing the International Energy Agency, which is based in Paris, and which is the institution that, in a way, protects, oil consuming countries. And so the International Energy Agency, in the case of an oil supply shock, has emergency measures that are in play, holds some reserves of oil. The idea is impose states to hold some reserves of oil so that if there is oil supply shock, there is a quick response that can kick in and protect oil, consuming countries. So this is one example of how international law has helped in this sense. But again, you can think of a different example. And here I'm referring to hydropower, and in particular, hydropower projects that involve two states. So think of those big water courses that cross several states. And so the countries decide that they want to build a hydropower plant using the flow of the water from these international water course. And one country one day decides, the upstream decides to stop the flow of the water for various reasons. As a result, the hydropower plant can't operate anymore because, it doesn't receive anymore the necessary flow of the water, which it will use to produce hydropower. How do you prevent that? Well, again, you have a hydropower treaty, which establishes bilateral obligations and creates, much more legal security, legal certainty for the countries involved. So there are ways in which you can respond, thanks to international law, to these intentional interruptions in energy supply. Unintentional interruptions. Well, again, if it's an environmental threat, you can do your best to predict it and, try to cope with the power shortage. But one could even say that an unintentional interruption could be something caused by a third party. And here I'm referring to examples of cyber intrusions, terrorism that affect energy infrastructure. So this is something that is not dependent on you, is not dependent on nature, is a third party that is attacking, your energy infrastructure. And this has happened already. How do you respond to that? Well, under international law, obviously, rules on prohibition of use of force, trying to detect who is responsible, trying to, protect yourself, adopting countermeasure. Obviously, it's a complex topic. I don't have the time to really delve into this today, but it's just to see all the different roles that international law can play. And yes, I think just to enable the audience to come in with questions, I will stop here. But I hope I have generated enough. I can generate enough discussion in these last 20 minutes. Happy to be, to respond to questions or even to hear points, comments, challenges to what I've developed as a theory over the years. But thank you very much for listening in and looking forward to your comments and questions.
Excellent. Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. And I obviously have questions and be glad to jump in to start, but let me open it up to everybody online first. If anyone has a question, all I ask is to please go ahead and unmute yourself. First questioner can just jump in. Anyone else, please remember to raise your hand while a question and answer is underway. I'll also be monitoring the chat window if anyone prefers just to put yourself into the queue to make sure you get answered in that way. And with that, Moses, I just saw you turned on your camera. I didn't know if you had a question. Oh, there's our answer.
Maybe am I going to kick conversation? And thank you, Professor Morgandi, for your great presentation. And my question is about the role of regional organizations. What role for them in ensuring the energy security from that perspective of international law?
Yeah, it's a fantastic point. Regional organizations have a very important role in this field because obviously every region is different. And it's important to understand the specific of each context and to respond to the specific issues that each region has. One, obviously, organization which is not regional, but helps, for instance, in the context of renewables, is so-called IRENA, which is a platform where countries can discuss how to switch best to renewables and share, ideas, know-how, challenges. And despite the fact that it's not a regional organization, it's an organization that, really attempts to create dialogues, in different parts of the world to really try to make the transition happen. Now, because this is a global problem, despite the fact that regional organizations are extremely important, we can't forget that we also need to take a very, international approach to this. And especially when we look at climate change, we see how important it is to keep, the big picture, because, Europe can do a great job, but without having China and the US on board, we won't get really anywhere. So it's important always to keep, the big picture in mind. But another example that comes to mind, I don't know if you're familiar with this, is the so-called Nzaou, which is this network of transmission operators, electricity transmission operators in Europe. And it's part of the attempt of the European Union to really create a harmonized framework and facilitate the transmission of electricity And so this, for instance, is an example of a regional organization that is very successful, because when you transmit electricity, so many variables that you need to take into account. And obviously, who are you thinking first off is your neighbors. Where I'm going to buy electricity, I'm going to buy them. I'm going to buy it from my neighbors. But even when you decide to, buy electricity, then it has to be transmitted. And so you need to connect the grids. You need to really, do these in the correct way. And this is, for instance, a regional organization that I know has been very successful, and way goes beyond just cooperation between states, because it brings on board the operators. And I think one important aspect about energy law and the energy sector is that you always need to have a multi-layered approach. It's not enough to have the states on board. You really also need the private sector. You really need all the different contractors, and you really need a framework that is quite complex. So clearly regional organizations have an important role to play, and there are many, even in Asia, ASEAN. I mean, there are many examples, and I think they perform a very significant role.
Thank you. And Aubin, do you have any follow-up, or should I go ahead and turn to other questions from the audience?
You can go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Agente, I see you have your hand up. All right, good morning. It's good to see you, although I can't quite see you. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I must have a glitch on my system. All right, then. Then I'll throw a question out because I have something, but I will also confess this is an area that's not my expertise. So this question may be a little bit afield, but it strikes with the connection between energy security and national security is actually is very direct in certain instances. Interruption of energy supplies is oftentimes the direct precursor to aggressive military action. One example just pops to mind, for example, is that one of the precipitating incidents that led Japan to attack the United States was the United States' decision to cut off gasoline supplies to Japan, which essentially forced the imperial government's hand. So I know there's a deep well of international law dealing with the legality of embargoes. I'm also aware that there's a deep body of law as well on what constitutes hostile aggressive action on the part of one state onto another that would be prohibited under the UN Charter. I was curious whether or not there was any role to play for international organizations, be it the UN, be it NATO, to interpret the intentional interruption of energy supplies as essentially a hostile act that is prescribed and subject to international prohibitions in a way that would trigger some of the compulsory mechanisms available under international law. I know the ICJ has played a role in some cases, particularly with Iran, but I don't think I've ever seen someone directly say messing with a nation's energy supply can be a hostile action akin to an act of war.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. And I think you're touching a very sensitive nerve there, because clearly from a factual point of view, if you can actually trace back that act to a state, and you can say that state is responsible for that attack to that energy infrastructure, there are, of course, more extreme actions, and is not really perhaps the most serious act that you can think of, being war the most serious. But as you say, it's a precursor. It's such a severe attack on another state infrastructure, and it can lead to so much disruption. It can be interpreted as, a step towards an act of war, and could also indirectly be labeled as an indirect act of war. However, you're perfectly right that under international law, that link hasn't been established yet. And often, all these attacks are, in a way, they point the finger towards non-state actors. and whether that suits, governments, so that in a way you say, well, it's a non-state actor that perpetrated that attack. And under international law, when it's a non-state actor that perpetrated an attack, it's very difficult to imagine, how you're going to react to that, because you can only really deal with another state actor. And so this is in a way a gap in the system, because by usually pointing the finger towards a non-state actor, you as a victim, you as a state who is a victim of an attack, are in a way, impotent. And what are you can't really take countermeasures in a way that under international law is considered legitimate. And so it's a very tricky question, but I think one where international law may evolve and over time design ways to respond to these satisfactorily, because at the moment is a huge gap in the system, and you're only entitled to take countermeasures when you're able to establish that an attack came from a state, and you are certain you can show a causal link. But that also is extremely rare, and unless that is proven, you sort of left with not much. Then of course you can operate outside of international law and do whatever you want in a way, but that also may then trigger a reaction. And I mean, one thing which is different, but just to give a sense, Russia is building this Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which goes through the Baltic precisely to bypass Ukraine. And basically the construction of the pipeline has almost been completed. However, because of the pressure on not allowing Russia to bypass Ukraine, and therefore, making the conflict with Ukraine worse, and also making Europe in a way an accomplice to some extent to allowing Russia to create this situation, the pipeline hasn't been operating so far. And in a situation like that, you can envisage if, Russia were able to operate the pipeline, some states, including the US, are considering taking countermeasures. But then there is a direct link, because this is not, an attack operated by a state against another state. Or, I mean, you could see it as, a hostile act, the fact of building this pipeline, but it's not the same as saying, I attacked your energy infrastructure. And only in this context, where you can really tell who the actors are and what's really going on, you can imagine a state, adopting a countermeasure. Outside of this concept, when we're talking about cyber attack and terrorism, it's extremely rare to be able to trace that back to a state. And therefore, the answer is basically, not there. The system doesn't really allow you to respond satisfactorily.
Well, it does seem to raise some interesting echoes with international law's treatment of shared resources such as water, where upstream and downstream nations each owe obligations to each other, and interference with one's use and reliance of the other does trigger some international obligations and duties for compensation. I'll pause here. We're getting a little bit towards the end of the hour. Any other questions from the audience? Okay, well then I'll ask one other question, and this is perhaps from my perspective as an environmental lawyer. In terms of the long-term perspective and the impacts of the pivot to decarbonized energy as a mandate for a transition of the energy system, and the impact it has on the security of nations that rely on existing energy infrastructure, I guess I want to make sure, are you saying there's a tension? Does that mean that obligations under, say, for example, the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement are going to conflict with other international legal obligations to maintain the security of energy supplies among sovereign actors? And if so, how do you resolve that tension? Because I can see it, but I'm not sure what the answer is, because unless you're going to say that you have to slow down the transition to make sure that it happens in a way that preserves stability. But I'm not sure there is a middle point like that.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I focus more on identifying the conflict than on identifying the ways to address the conflict. And perhaps we can think about that later. But just to confirm, yes, I have identified this tension, and the reason is simple. When you want to attract foreign investment, you need to protect the investment made by the investors. And when you want to sign up to the WTO club in a way, and you sign up to liberalization of the system, you undertake obligations. And because our obligations under international law when it comes to climate change arose later, than when these systems were established, the WTO system, as well as, the system of protection of foreign investment. In a way, it's like saying, well, the system were designed at different times, having different interests and needs in mind. The only way for the system to be able to reconcile what are at the moment opposing needs is by trying to, redesign itself and saying, okay, let's actually try to design a new system which at the same time facilitates investment and trade in the energy sector, but also respects the environment and enables the transition. And this is down to the states, because we're talking about multilateral treaties here. And it's down to the states to sit down and say, I think we need to change the rules of the game. But that is highly unlikely, because even to amend, the WTO agreement is extremely hard. And to imagine, you can do it more easily when you're talking about bilateral investment treaties. In fact, the new generation of a bilateral investment treaties have, sustainable development in mind, climate change in mind. And in fact, the new generation don't really resemble the old generation. And precisely because they try to take into account the fact that it doesn't make any sense to, promise certain things to foreign investors if you know that you have undertaken an obligation to phase out fossil fuels. So it's extremely difficult, but the tension is there. And I think 50% of the job is spotting the tension, identify that there is an issue. And then the other remaining 50% is trying to face the issue. But the reason why I want to emphasize the existence of this conflict is because I think not enough attention has been paid to the fact that the conflict actually is there. Because we're all so keen to say, let's make the transition happen. We forget that the transition won't happen unless we take steps to really change the rules that govern, foreign investment, trade, and so on and so forth. So in a way is not seeing the problem. And so that's why I like to emphasize this. And obviously from an energy security point of view, the transition is somehow a threat. Because once we have, I realized that, this idea of peak oil is an old idea. We all know now that with the technology we have, shale oil, shale gas, the ability to drill very deep in the ocean, much deeper than we thought it was possible, there is no shortage of oil and gas. However, that's not the problem anymore. The problem is that, you shouldn't be digging out too much oil or too much gas, and you should be phasing out these. Also because from an economic point of view, financial point of view, if, like Germany did with the nuclear power plants, in 20 years, you really need to change the policy quickly, all the investments made and all the, the shareholders will end up with so-called stranded assets because, they won't see any return anymore. So it's extremely difficult to imagine that the energy transition won't actually create a problem from an energy security point of view. The only way to, enable them to, in a way, go hand in hand is by redesigning the way we approach energy security. And there is the issue of intermittency, the fact that renewables are not reliable, the fact that, you don't always have sun, you don't always have wind. And yes, you can store energy, but, we haven't developed, perhaps the best technology to be able to really guarantee a huge supply. The fact that energy demand is increasing, because at the moment, a huge part of the population around the world doesn't have access to electricity. But once everybody will, it's very hard. So I don't want to sound like I'm a climate change denier, it's totally the opposite. But I think that we cannot, in a way, be blind in front of this problem. And that's why I think this is a fantastic topic.
And I think everyone would agree with it. The perception of the issue is probably the most important first step. And with that, I think our hour is about up. Thank you for a marvelous presentation. It's been an honor to have you, especially as our final speaker for the year. And what I'd like to do now is turn the mic over to Aubin to close out our session and give, if you would like, any announcements of upcoming speakers.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. Magnificent. So our next speaker, and the first one who's going to kick off our series next year, is Professor Michael Livermore from the University of Virginia. And it will be on January the 20th, 2022. So yeah, so you can go ahead, Tracy.
Okay, well,
yeah.
Then I will say to everyone, if you can, please join us. I'll tell you, Professor Livermore is always a fascinating mind, particularly on issues of regulatory policy and economic concepts in their application. With that, I hope all of you have a wonderful holiday season, and we look forward to seeing you in 2022, hopefully post-COVID. Take care, everyone. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.